Okay, so I shall see if I can share my presentation. So I think now you see my presentation as well.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. So anyway, good morning, or perhaps it's already afternoon for you, but it's morning in Tallinn, quite snowy, and I'm Katrin Nyman Metcalf, Adjunct Professor at the Tallinn University of Technology, and I think you mentioned you had already introduced me, so it's very nice to be in Tbilisi, even if only virtually. I like the city very much. I worked at the university, even there. So, and I was asked to talk about regulation. So a bit of law in the digital world. And the title is then how to regulate data and the digital space. I'm not going to talk about specific law, any country-specific law. I'm going to give some examples from Estonia, but otherwise it's not, so those of you who are not of a legal background, you don't need to worry that it's going to be too much sort of, how to say, regular law, because that's not really what's the most interesting and relevant for the digital society. For a number of reasons, mainly because it's actually still very much a work in progress to think about, so how can it be regulated, and can it be regulated? And I mean, of course, you can regulate anything in the sense of writing laws about it, but if these cannot be properly implemented, then it's pointless. So, the legal regulatory discussion around digitalization is more, maybe we could say, creative. It's more of a question of what can be done, what will it mean, and who should do it, and so on. So it's very interdisciplinary, actually. I know now in the academic world, it's very popular to talk about interdisciplinarity in the sense of working with other faculties and so, but it's also in the, let's say, the real world, not just the academic world, it's necessary because the lawyers like myself, we need to know from the IT people what is actually possible. The technical people need to understand, so what limits should there be and so on. So anyway, that's a bit introduction. So what are then the challenges specifically that should be regulated, or that mean that there is a need for regulation? Well, I put first there, I put trust, and with an exclamation mark even, because it's very important to create trust for a number of reasons. It's not just because it's nice that people can be trusting, but many of those ways we've had in the traditional world, the non-digital one, to verify things, they are no longer valid because they were very often based on actually being in the same physical space. Like you would verify people's identity in ways which have been created over centuries. You would use different physical things to check on things when you were buying something, for instance. So the trust is very relevant for the commercial dealings online, but also, of course, for e-governance, because if you are going to do important transactions, you need to know that these are really with the person you're actually thinking you're doing it with, and that the results will be valid. And so it's you don't create trust only by law, but law is definitely a tool for creating trust. And I'll talk a little bit more later about data protection, which is perhaps the first thing that comes to mind for people thinking about laws around the digital society. Many people even perhaps a bit annoyed with all these strict data protection rules. But for that also, one very important reason for that is that when so much data is out there in this intangible form, we need to trust that those who deal with this data follow certain rules. That's why data protection and also this whole concept of trust is actually also a form of cybersecurity, which is a term that, as I'm sure all of you there well know, is very broad. It includes data protection in law and things like that, but also, of course, it includes military protection. It includes policing. Crimes can happen in cyberspace and so on. So this is also a reason why we actually need rules and laws, because not only good things happen, and we need to sort of do as much as possible to create security. And when I put this perception, I think that's probably what I already in a way talked about, because the question of perception is also this, that if people don't feel secure, if they think digital data is not secure or certain transactions are somehow vulnerable, they will not want to use digital tools. It doesn't actually matter then whether it's true that these things are not secure. Digital data, if handled well, can be more secure than paper-based one. But if people are worried, that actually doesn't matter, you know, that there's nothing to worry about, because people will not use digital tools, and then you cannot create this sort of good digital society. So on top of all of this, we now have very recently the question also of AI, which is often seen as this kind of black box of algorithms that we don't quite understand. Because one of the tools, we could say, to try to create some form of regulation, even when, as I'll come back to why it's quite difficult to create this regulation in the digital world, but one of the tools to facilitate was transparency, that we need to know who is doing what, who is responsible for what, and then people hopefully will trust better. And when it comes to the whole question of artificial intelligence and generally of algorithms doing things, almost the point of that technology is that we as humans don't easily know what's happening, why, because this is done by artificial intelligence, not directly by the human intelligence. So that creates a problem. And then, of course, I already talked of perception. If people in, say, administration or judges or so feel that this is all too unknowable, they may try to stop things being used. So it's really in the interest of those who want to promote technology to try to create some form of regulation, so that regulation doesn't just stop and hinder development, but deals with these fears that people may have. So why is it difficult? What are the special reasons for the difficulties with regulation? Eggs in the margin, which is not sort of for no reason at all, but you probably have heard of this expression, at least in English, of this chicken and egg, like what comes first? Did the chicken come before the egg, or the egg before the chicken? And with technology and regulation, it's a bit like that. So what should come first? And there's no very good answer to that. I can say that straight away. On the one hand, of course, we cannot regulate something that doesn't exist yet. So there has to be some technology, and it has to have developed so that we know a bit what it can do before it can be regulated. But at the same time, if you start regulating things like too late, if you let it develop too much, it's going to be difficult. And internet itself is a good example of that, which developed like almost without regulation. And now the discussion around regulation on internet is all about how can we prevent the worst negative consequences of this unregulated space. And it's more difficult now because people have got used to it being very, very little regulated. I'm not saying actually I want lots of regulation, but it's just that in the beginning there was perhaps more of this romantic notion that let's just all work together and let's have this new way of cooperating. But then eventually you start seeing the sort of downside of this with various exploitation and crimes and things like that happening. So anyway, this chicken and egg is the sort of big question. And then we have other challenges because regulation should be as technology neutral as possible. I think pretty much everybody who deals with regulation agrees with this. This isn't just in the digital age, but this is really a concept that started about in the 1980s when one started seeing that technologies were developing quite rapidly. So if you put in law exactly how something should be done, like with technical parameters and so, this risked becoming obsolete. So it was better to focus on the aim, like why do we have rules? Perhaps this technology is polluting, for instance, let's say with car engines. So instead of saying in the law what the car engine should look like, you say the limit of certain particles that could be emitted, for instance. This is easier often said than done, but still it helps quite a lot with how regulation should be done. If you need technical detail, those can be in other things than law, like in secondary legal acts, which can be changed more easily and so. And one concrete example from e-governance there is digital identities, signatures and identities, where there is a need for some specific rules to show which types of identities are going to be acceptable in court of law, for instance. But you can put the details of what these look like and how they are created and all that in other documents than the law, and the law just explains who has the right to decide which of these identities can be used and so. Because we can't leave it up to just people to invent their own digital identities, even if there might be lots of good ones to be invented, because then we lose the legal certainty in society that people trust that this particular identity is really valid. Another challenge then is to create this kind of what I just mentioned, legal certainty without stifling innovation. So we want, on the one hand, people, and we must think of, ordinary people, whatever that is, but people who are not experts on digital things, they must also feel comfortable with using, for instance, a digital identity. And that's a bit legal certainty. It's a legal term, but it actually really just means, that people in general know. So what are the rules? What can we use? And can I be sure that if I follow these ways of doing something, I've done everything correctly, even if I don't understand the technology, but this is the way to do things. So if these are things that may be sort of challenging, difficult, then the next point I put on the slide as well is perhaps helping those who make rules, that often there's a question of step-by-step changes, even if they happen in short time. When we all know digital technologies develop rapidly, but still it's not usually from nothing to everything. But we've got used to, for instance, using various digital technologies. Now when perhaps we have more and more artificial intelligence, we already know at least a bit about use of technology. So many things can be done in this more step-by-step manner. Also with digital identity, a lot of countries start having internet banking or mobile banking, both, before they have official digital IDs. So then people have got used to identifying themselves in a digital way. So it's easier than when it becomes the sort of dominant way of identifying yourself. And this all already, I think, has explained a bit why. And one thing when I work, because I work in lots of different countries, practically with sort of e-governance, giving e-governance advice. And then one of the things that I, as a lawyer, then working on the legal side, always sort of start by saying is that you shouldn't make too many specialized laws. Quite often, those who work with e-governance or digitalization of society, not just governance, they often, well, another point is they often don't include legal competence at first, but it starts from a sort of technical side. And at one point they think, okay, we need now to make the rules, and think that this means writing lots of laws. And this is not a good idea, because then it's very difficult to keep it technology neutral if you make special laws for everything. But also, often you don't need these special laws, because we're not doing digital things to do digital things. We're doing it because we are doing banking, or we are voting, or we are applying for building permission. We're doing transactions which already exist in society and in legislation. So what you need to do is just look at what is different now when we don't use paper. And then see, is there anything that needs to change in the rules because of this? The question whether I can get the building permission to build a new house, that's not a digital question. It doesn't matter how I apply for it. The questions that are different are often horizontal, meaning that they don't just apply to one type of transaction. And these are questions to do with identity and signature, already mentioned many times, because this is different. I now have to identify myself without using those ways of doing it that we've used for hundreds of years. And then the data protection, that's not just digital, but also, again, it's different. Data protection in the analog world often consisted of physical things like locking a safe. Now this has to be dealt with differently, but data protection doesn't really matter. Like the act of protecting data is not different in the banking sector or the health sector or the government sector. So that's why these questions, and that's again something that actually facilitates regulation. You don't need special laws and everything, because those things that are different, they apply in similar manners across the board of society, public and private. And as I said, data protection is what perhaps most people, also non-lawyers, are familiar with from sort of digital regulation. And I'm sure you all know of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And Georgia is not yet an EU member state. And even if you were not a candidate country, even if it is a country in another part of the world than Europe, then people know of the GDPR and it's relevant. One could ask them, why is everybody so aware of this EU legal act? And it is because, for two reasons, it has actually global significance. One is a very practical one, that it says that countries or companies or anybody, any subjects, cannot use data of EU subjects if they don't have a data protection system that's at least as, like, meets certain minimum standards. So at least is to some extent similar to the GDPR system, not identical, but similar in the eyes of the European Commission. So it's the EU that determines whether the country's rules are good enough. The EU, as you well know, is a market of hundreds of millions of quite wealthy people. So no company or country in the world would say, oh, we don't care about dealing with EU. So it means that there is this necessity for all countries in the world to actually look at the GDPR and have rules that come up to a certain standard. So this is, of course, very important like that, but I would still say that I think the main reason this piece of legislation is so well known is that if one peels off this very typical EU type of language, it actually is it makes a lot of sense, because what it says is not that you cannot use data. It just says that you have to think of the purpose why you are using somebody's personal data. And when you know that purpose, you use the data in proportion to that purpose. So you basically have to have a system from thinking through how data is going to be used. And in the private sector, the reason for using data is normally consent of the person, the data subject. In the public sector, there are many other reasons, like that you have to use the data to perform a function. So this is also sort of listed there, as I'm sure many of you know, but it's really just this process of, okay, just because we need now a lot of data for so many different services, doesn't mean we just use it like that. And just to mention some of the points I was on the slide, that I already talked about this with the trust and the perceptions. And it's true that in many countries, people still feel worried about digital data, often without reason. And as I said already, legislation doesn't mean that people are all suddenly stop worrying, but at least it helps, because you can show that, no, okay, yes, we need to know all of this about you in the modern society. We need this data, but there are certain rules about how it deals with, which is also why the law and the systems created under the law should focus on the type of data. Health data is very sensitive, for instance, whereas my address is not. So you protect data according to what it says, not whether it's digital or not. And that means that certain issues perhaps are already again dealt with in legislation. All that's different is that you no longer physically lock files away, but you ask the tech people to create the technical systems to sort of lock the files, and the lawyers give the advice on what should be locked in which way. And all of this is based also on the fact that protection of your private life is also human right. So we have that right. So it's the practical side is the data protection systems and laws, but it comes all from very important background that yes, anybody who lives in society with other people has to share certain information. How could the state organize education if it doesn't know when children are born? Or how could it organize healthcare if it has no idea where people live? So yes, we share our data, but at the same time, we are aware that it's handled properly. The way before, we might have felt safe because we knew that sensitive documents were kept in a locked cupboard. So as I said, I would give a few small examples from Estonia, because as I'm sure many of you know, we are very leading in e-governance. Many ways, one of the most advanced countries in the world for e-governance. I like to point this out, not just because, Estonia is quite interesting. I'm sure in Georgia, you know Estonia to some extent, but in large parts of the world, people have hardly ever heard of the country. We're very small. We've been re-independent for a bit more than 30 years. So it's not, like as if you have to be big and rich and all of that to be leading in e-governance. And you know that in Georgia as well. I mean, you are much more advanced than countries than the US and Germany, for instance. So this is interesting because it shows a little bit a very interesting aspect of digital society, that it does really give opportunities based on other things than the traditional ones of being big and rich, for instance. So I'm sure many of you, I know Becca for sure knows the Estonian X-Road interoperability system very well. I also don't have so much time, so I'm not going into huge details. So for some of you, you've heard it before. If you haven't heard it before, I'll just very quickly try to mention those points that are relevant for my side of it, the sort of regulatory side. The whole idea of such a system is, of course, to improve, to use technology, to the potential of technology to improve public administration, governance in general. So this also goes back to the point I mentioned about not creating new rules and systems, and also not creating new authorities and things, but to create a system to help administration to deal with the things it has to deal with anyway, and in any country. So interoperability is one of the key words for a good system of e-governance and also of general data governance. It's not creation of a gigantic centralized database. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you why that is a bad idea. It creates a single point of failure, which both technical and legal people could see is not a good idea. So instead, you create then the system that databases communicate with one another. Where there is a cloud at the image, it used to be drawn as a road, which is where the name also comes from. But it's just an image, but it's there to illustrate that it's the connection, not one big system. And each authority has, or each company that joins, has its own security service and is responsible for the security. And what is new with this system is that you can directly from your workstation access data in a database, regardless of whether that database is in another authority and which other authority. So you don't need to ask for the data, because sometimes we forget to explain what it actually is used for. So what is different with this system? And what is different is this, that from my workstation, in my whichever authority I work in, or in some cases in a private company, if I have a legitimate, meaning based on law, right to see data that exists in another database, then I do that directly. I don't have to ask anybody for it. The question of who gets access to what is handled by agreements between those who possess the data and those who need to use it. So it's in a way a very simple process. It's first of all, I should say also in Estonia, it's illegal to have the database with data that already exists in another public database. You cannot ask people more than once for certain information. So if I'm creating a service and I need certain data, I know that this data exists already. How do I know that? Because there is a catalog of databases. You cannot see the data, but you see that there is a database with such information. This catalog is just a list online. Anybody can look at it. And if you have a public database, you have to put it in that catalog. So, okay, I can see somebody already has gathered this data. I contact them and I say, I'm creating this new service and I would need access to this data. And then we make a contract, very simple. There are standard ones that one can use, but one can just do it in any way as well, between the authority that has the data and the one who wants to use it. But these never give the full right to access data to the authority, because everything is based on individuals. And that's this black box you can see in the corner of the image, the EID. So you have to digitally identify yourself to see anything. So just for an authority or a public company, the light blue boxes there are private companies. Sorry, I meant private company, not public. But for companies or public bodies, nobody can access data without the system knowing who the individual is. So the legal and the technical access should be seen as separate things. Just because technically it's easy to give access to data doesn't mean that this is done. That's the second question. When you have to see, so who actually needs to see this data? So the same kind of questions as are asked in the GDPR actually was something that we did long before, because this system is much older than the GDPR, that you ask, so what's the purpose for you to have this data and how are you going to use it? That also determines how many individuals in a certain authority are given access to data, because it should be linked to your exact position and not to the authority. We don't have ministry computers or police computers that if you get to a certain device, you can see something. No, you can see nothing unless the system knows who you are. And so a benefit of this, apart from, I come back to other benefits as well, but another benefit of this is that you allow the competence that exists for which data should be gathered, how should it be kept, and all of those questions to remain with the different authorities that are experts on this. So you don't need to centralize anything. So the Ministry of Agriculture can still be the one who knows what data do we need on agriculture, and the local authority of Tallinn will still be the one who deals with that. So again, you don't need to change everything in the sense of like creating new authorities. The only new authority is one that deals with the sort of technical issues and the actual functioning. They cannot enter into databases. They're just responsible for the functioning of the system. But each authority remains in charge of their own area of competence. And because you need to identify yourself to access anything, I think we have a fairly unique system in Estonia for actually protecting data and for creating trust in the system for individuals. Somebody accesses data, it leaves a footprint, meaning that the system knows exactly who did this. And so as a regular citizen in Estonia, I have one website where I can see all the data that's held about me in which authority. I access this with my digital identity. And there I can also see if somebody has looked at my data. I can see only which authority did it and when, but I can ask them and they are obliged to answer me why they did that. Within the authority, they can also see who did it, which individual. So if you work in a position where you have the right to access data, you know that you can be asked at any moment, so why did you do this? What was the purpose? What was the proportion with the purpose? So this gives a lot of this transparency for use of data. It also means, as I already mentioned, that this once only principle that this lot talked about, that you don't ask people for data more than once, that this actually works. And this is a principle that's important, not just because it's comfortable and good that you don't need to answer the same question, but it also means that there's no risk that, different, let's say just simple, different address of people would be held by different authorities. So somebody would lose, or you forget to notify your new address to somewhere, or you notify and it's lost or something. That cannot happen if there is only one database with the address that everybody uses. And you also eliminate this risk of just, transfer. Every time I have to give somebody some information, there is a risk that, they might lose it somehow, or I don't know. Somebody asked me, for instance, on a Friday afternoon for some information, and they don't use it until the new working week, where maybe something has changed in the meantime, and so these things are eliminated, and that's actually thanks to the technology. So here it's really an example of this, how it couldn't really be done if we didn't have it in digital format. Because, for instance, this footprint, if people are asked to sign somewhere when they use data, they wouldn't do it when they are using it wrongly or sloppily or something. So it needs to be an automatic technical solution for that. And of course, it also gives citizens an easy way of seeing what's there, because it can all be in one place. You can actually access it. So I will finish soon. I know we started a bit later, but I will go through some few things a bit quickly, not to put you too much out of sync with the planned schedule you have. So what I've talked about now is in super advanced, not in the sense of using sort of AI or so. So this is a bit like, say, it's this step-by-step approach that we have certain technologies already, and then we now have more advanced technologies. And what we need to think about when deciding whether we should go further and what technologies to use is that if we digitalize existing problems with, for instance, poor data in databases or something, or a lack of trust of whatever it is, we're not solving the problems, we're just moving them to another environment. So this is why one needs to think about also these things, that the basic data is good enough, those who are gathering it know what they're doing, and so on. We also need to think, of course, of things like, do people actually have access to internet? This is such a basic thing. It's in practice, I can tell you, maybe it sounds surprising, but it's quite often almost forgotten that people get kind of carried away with creating digital solutions. And in the end, a lot of people cannot access this because they just don't have the devices, or they don't have the internet. We have all over the world now, very many people have access to mobile devices, even in developing countries and so. But then that doesn't mean that necessarily all types of services are suitable. So you need to really think who knows what, who can use this technically and knowledge-wise and so. But then what I also often like to point out when I talk about these things, and I've already said we have lots of benefits from technology, but sometimes maybe that doesn't mean that we should use the technology anyway. Maybe certain services should retain a human involvement, just for reasons that have nothing to do with technology. Because, for instance, with notarized signatures that we still use in Estonia for real estate transactions, for instance, we do it digitally, but we have to go to a notary to sign certain things. It's not because it couldn't be all done just electronically, but it's to underline the importance of a certain transaction. And it's Estonian people who talk about e-governance is often mentioned, it's a bit like a joke, it's actually true, but mentioned sort of jokingly that the only thing you cannot do online in Estonia is get married. And it's true that you cannot do it just online, but it's not because we couldn't solve that technologically, but maybe you should think twice before you get married. So maybe the fact that you actually cannot do it electronically serves another purpose that is kind of a, say, societal purpose, nothing to do with technology. So I think these are also questions that should come in the sort of thinking around regulation. So do we actually use the full potential of technology? Is it a good idea? Sometimes maybe no. Sometimes maybe we just keep people for sort of kind of say soft reasons. So I'll sum up with some key considerations that I've mentioned most of them. I mentioned the parallel systems that's in one of the bottom squares. There's quite a lot, and that's again what I mean by that is that, you know, we don't create rules just because of the technology. They don't need to be changed. The global borderless nature, I haven't talked so much about because, of course, limited time, I have to stick to certain things. But also, I think this is perhaps what people are the most aware of, also who don't work with regulation as a challenge. Like, should we have international treaties? Because if countries make laws, it's so easy to base yourself somewhere else in the digital world. These are questions that, you know, there are no simple answers to. There are discussion questions, and with the way the world looks at the moment geopolitically, I think nobody expects any good binding international agreements, which is why we are relying on companies themselves making also unbinding rules, the countries that sort of do have similar outlook on the world coming together to agree on, say, voluntary codes of practice. And so, and I think this is very much like what we have to do at the moment, this kind of step-by-step approach. We're not going to have any good global rules. I think nobody imagines that even. So, and I think the fact that the countries that have suggested various international rules for internet are Russia and China says a bit about what type of rules that were suggested and why they are not acceptable to the free world. And technology neutrality and the obsolescence I talked a lot about, and the trust I also talked a lot about. So let me just finish with a quote that I put up in the original French and in my own English translation. And it just says something which you could find in lots of countries' laws, perhaps, but I think it's quite interesting that it comes from the law on data protection from the Republic of Benin, among the 10 poorest countries in the world, but which has quite an advanced system of e-governance. And I think this is interesting because it also shows this, what I already mentioned, with how, you know, different countries have different opportunities, not perhaps based only on the kind of traditional things we would say as strengths. And it just says this, that IT is a science at the service of man, which shouldn't infringe human identity, private life, human rights, individual or collective freedoms. And I like to sort of end with this to underline this. When we talk of regulation, we want to take the best of the technology. We don't want to stop it, but at the same time, we don't want technology to kind of rush ahead and take over. But it still should be for doing something useful. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer if there are any questions or comments. I think there should still be some moments of time for that.
Thanks, Katrin, for this interesting presentation. I have one question, and then from the audience, maybe there are a few questions and we will ask them. So one question regarding the AI. This last month, I'm like trying to research deeply this topic, and I found out about the guy. He's best known as a grandfather of AI. He first invented the neural networks, and he was working in Google. And you know probably his story that he quit now, and some kind of caution us that there is a huge risk of some huge technological, like existential risk, and we should somehow stop or conserve the working on AI and like postpone it like maybe 10 years after or something like that. And what you think about that? How we as a society can coordinate our effort, like international? Should we like make ring the alarm bells and start like regulating it worldwide, or is it like a Pandora box and we don't know what will happen next, and we should be cautious now and start regulating it now, and how it's possible to regulate it in a worldwide, like consolidate all this effort, and every country come up with some kind of stop button for the AI. Is it feasible?
Thank you. No, thank you for a very good question. And I think it's also, thank you for the way you put it. You mentioned where these sort of comes from. I mean, there are more people than who have sort of brought it up. But what's interesting with AI is that the people who have brought up the need for regulation or for kind of stopping or so are actually the people involved in creating the technology. And I think this is really important, because earlier, even only 5 years ago, maybe or so, the people who more talked about regulating or stopping digital technologies of different kinds, or e-governance or whatever, just digitalization, were often people who were a bit like, say, anti-technology, and perhaps didn't understand it well, or just the kind of people who chose to not like to, you know, who wouldn't even use mobile phones and who wouldn't like use social media because of kind of, you know, they didn't really like it. And then I think my instinct, and the same with lots of people who work in the field, was to a little bit perhaps, well, not dismiss them, even if maybe that's how we felt like we would want to dismiss them, but you kind of felt, okay, because they don't understand, for instance. I know myself, I've often explained why digital data is safer than other data, for the reasons I told you now as well, with this footprint left and so on. You had to just kind of explain to people that no, it's not safer to have a bunch of papers lying about in a cupboard or so. This has now changed, because now we have the actual AI creators ringing the alarm bells. And I think this is, at least for me personally, was a kind of really a thing which made me also, I'm not saying worried, but sit up and really pay attention, to put it that way, because we cannot dismiss these fears by saying, okay, well, you don't know really what you're talking about, and you don't know how well this can actually be used to be safe. So I think we have to accept that there are these huge risks that are unknowable, that we don't actually understand them. Because if the people who are created these systems fear these things, there obviously are risks. And why? Well, because it's so difficult to know what these technologies can actually be used for and how they can be developed. I think it's also almost impossible to put them back in the box, so to speak, because this has been shown through history with other technologies. When something has been developed and then it is found to be perhaps of more risk than benefit, it's still impossible to then uninvent it. And there have been discussions about, say, nuclear weapons, for instance, that maybe they should have been stopped completely, but once they have been developed, they cannot be stopped completely. So it's a bit easy to be perhaps frustrated and see that nothing can be done, because what would, of course, be a good idea is if there were some global rules about how, for instance, before new AI can be used, like that it needs to go through some kind of verification that it isn't too risky or so. But then, what I already mentioned, with current geopolitical system in the world, it's very difficult to imagine that all countries would agree on this. What would probably happen if some countries agreed on something like that is that there would be countries which would be like flags of convenience, as you know from shipping, that you just register your ships in a country which has less good laws. So that could easily happen with technology, that somebody, be it Iran, be it North Korea, be it Russia, somebody like that wouldn't follow the rules. So so the best thing, and I think the only thing that makes perhaps why we shouldn't all lose too much sleep of it, is that the discussion is now very much out there, and it's also out there with those who are creating technologies. And there are quite a lot of initiatives, private initiatives from private companies, but that are taken very seriously, that they actually are looking at ways of, for instance, not throwing everything out there, but delaying the introduction of certain technologies, having kind of voluntary things that sort of like, say, systems committees. And so it may sound like this is not very strong tools, and they're not strong tools in the traditional legal way. But if these are the people who are actually dealing with these things, I think this is something that can be useful. And I think one important thing there is that a lot of experts are also saying now that this discussion about the big existential risks, it actually is a bit dangerous, because maybe then people forget to look at the day-to-day risks. So there are now quite a lot of experts who, again, through these voluntary systems, they really think of also like functioning of systems in this more less dramatic way, to create a sort of environment of like having some kind of, let's say, framework for taking decisions. So I think this is, it's a weak tool, but at the same time, if there is an interest of those who deal with it to kind of have such systems, it also has the benefit that, again, coming back to the geopolitical situation in the world, that it's easier for countries that otherwise don't even talk to one another to kind of accept these non-binding rules, because there isn't the same kind of attention as going to sign an international treaty, you know, that then you have to be agree to kind of do that, and you know, it gets attention, and you know, you have to really show that you are now on the same side with those countries. With these informal things, it's possible for countries that do not really like to show that they would like to follow a suggestion from, say, the US, to quietly accept it because they are aware of the same risks and so. But yes, it's a good point you made, and I think, unfortunately, we do have new risks that we didn't even know about only a few years ago, and they definitely are there. And the people who are bringing these to our attention are not alarmists, but they are actually experts.
So yeah, the good thing that you mentioned, that the people who are the professionals in this field, they are alarming us, and we as a society should somehow be more cautious, I guess, about this fact. And the one important topic also, that in this black box of algorithms, when there is big data, even the creators of algorithms can't understand how the program or algorithm computes the result. That's also the kind of very alarming, because you don't control the outcome, what will be the outcome. So you are generally a kind of, even the creator is in the black box.
Exactly, yeah. Mm.
And that's a really big issue, I guess. Thanks for the interesting answer. And here I will give the mic to the new question.
Hi, Katrin. Thank you for the very interesting lecture. I have a question. What emerging technological trends or innovations do you believe will significantly shape our future, and how can societies best prepare for these changes? For example, the dependence on AI from our society today is quite alarming. And what do you think about this?
Well, I think in addition to what we already talked about, it's true, it is alarming. I think what again, I mean, it's very difficult to predict the future. Technology moves so quickly, but I still think that we will see more in more countries, and in those countries that have started with sort of, say, e-governance, if we call it like that, to develop more of these fairly simple, we could say, even solutions. So many of the things, for instance, that we already have in Estonia, where we have this very wide use of digital identities. And I think this is going to come in many more countries, and they are going to be fairly simple solutions simply because of this, that they will be targeted at a lot of people using them. And one interesting country to look at is India, for instance, which is now the most populous country in the world, still largely poor, a lot of people even illiterate, and they use quite a lot of digital tools for things like for people to get different benefits and so kind of simple things that everyday usage. So I think what going to change the sort of day-to-day life of people in the next sort of, I don't know, let's say about 10 years then around the world are going to be these kind of things. I took this quote from Benin, a country I work quite a lot in. They have introduced digital identities for people who often had no identity before. I mean, obviously they had an identity, but they had no birth certificates or papers on paper, anything like that, simply nothing. They'd never been registered anywhere. So the first time they register, it's also digital, so that they can also then have access to healthcare and education, thanks to the society actually now knowing where they live. And so I think we are going to see more of that. This very new possibilities with AI, yes, there are going to be all sorts of different things, but I don't think that they are going to change the life of ordinary citizens so dramatically very soon. But I'm also totally willing to say I may be totally wrong, and already next week there may be something else. So because this is so unknowable, but somehow I still think, and maybe also hope, that what we will see is actually kind of accepting that technology can help lots of everyday things with fairly simple tech tools.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for such an interesting lecture. I would like to know, to your mind, how will artificial intelligence affect cybercrime rates?
Yeah, until now, this is again something you probably we don't really know, but until now, what I read somewhere quite recently was that they think not too much yet, but the cybercrime is growing all the time, but that is still actually human directed crime. And this is also interesting because it's often crimes that actually have existed for a long time, like fraud. It's not a new crime. It's just so much easier to send out thousands, tens of thousands of emails to try to defraud people rather than trying to find them in real life and to do it. So, but this is well established already. Networks doing this with all of these different scams, of whether it's romance scams or it's business scams or so, that the vast majority of this is still the sort of using fairly basic technologies, but this may be because nobody yet knows. So, but of course, and it's talked about like you could through artificial intelligence do even worse things. But I think maybe one reason it's not happened so much yet is simply that, again, it's even for those to develop it difficult sometimes to know exactly what it does. So you're perhaps, as a criminal, you have an interest in knowing what's happening, so you know when you can kind of hide yourself and when you can kind of benefit from your crimes. That this is the sort of today, or let's say maybe they'll say yesterday's technologies are actually more efficient. So but yeah, to say we don't know what will happen, but for the moment we still see a rise in cybercrime of a more traditional style, not
Thank
AI.
you.
Sorry, Katrin, we have finished our questions.
Yes.
Thank you again for joining us on the Cyber Festival and sharing your interesting perspectives. And have a great day. And I will say goodbye to you.
Thank you, everybody, and you have a great rest of the Cyber Festival as well. So, okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.